Well, hey out there, and welcome back to another edition of our Sacred Conversations series. Today, we are really privileged to have our friend Glenn Formica with us. And so the first thing I want to do is to welcome Glenn. Glenn, it's good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
I will say a little bit more by way of introduction in just a second, but let me say this first. I hope that all of you watching out there right now are doing okay. And I hope that you're making it through this week by week. It's not easy, I know. These conversations that we've been doing are designed to help us all explore some of the critical issues that have arisen in the world as a result of the coronavirus. Whether it's our own spiritual lives, our emotional and physical well-being, the state of arts and culture, or some of the more pressing social concerns around us, my hope is that these conversations can be used as markers or guideposts along a pathway that is, for all of us right now, ill-lit and never trod before, or at least very seldom trod. I think we need all the help we can get from the wisdom keepers and the light bearers all around us. I want you to know that I consider Glenn to be one of those wisdom keepers and bearers of light in these strange and dark times. Glenn is an attorney who specializes in immigration cases, among other things. I first got to know Glenn when he agreed to represent Malik and Zaida after they took up sanctuary in our church facilities. Glenn became the architect of our legal strategy as we sought relief for Malik and Zaida. He advised on ways to approach and handle ICE. He advised on how to involve our political leaders, on how to maneuver through the court system, and finally, how to achieve their successful release from sanctuary. Glenn was a masterful strategist in those moments, and I often thought that every person struggling with an immigration case should be so fortunate to have an attorney with as much foresight and imagination as Glenn. But Glenn is also a person of faith. In fact, some of the most effective pastoral counseling I have ever observed as a minister came from Glenn Formica, as he sought to allay the anxieties and fears that some of his charges were experiencing. Glenn takes more pro bono cases than any lawyer I have ever met. And he's got a passion for using the law to defend and protect the most vulnerable, rather than using the law as a weapon. For me, that's been one of the most transformative aspects of working with Glenn. It's the reminder first that laws can mean many things because laws are embedded in language. And second, that the law isn't merely a punitive mechanism, but it can be used to preserve the humanity and the dignity of individual lives. It is hard to recall that sometimes, but Glenn is one among us who helps me to do that, who helps all of us to do that. So that's all I will say by way of introduction. There's probably a lot more that I could and should say, but let me once again just say, Glenn, thank you for joining me for this conversation, and welcome again to this time. It's good to have you here.
Steve, thanks for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I mean, hearing you phrase it that way is a huge compliment.
It's meant that way.
But at the same time, I would probably tell you that to the extent that you're talking about, my good work, I would have to probably take a little bit of exception to that. Only because when I get involved with these cases, and I think you saw this with Malik and Zaida, that really had probably the smallest amount to do with the lawyer involved. And I say that partly, in a practical sense. I mean, just to dive in on the tops of your shoes, so to speak here, but
yeah.
I say that in a practical sense because that was really about that community coming together, your community coming together, your church, and making something happen, that left to the devices of an attorney could not have been possible. And that's not false humility. I mean, I've just witnessed that enough times that when a group comes together to work on a case, and I don't 100% know why it happens this way. It just does. That things that wouldn't normally happen seem to happen.
Yeah.
And, if I'm being Californian about it, meaning, sort of woo-woo and metaphysical about it, I would tell you it's the collective consciousness of everybody working together is creating the spirit and all that. And I don't discount that, because I definitely believe that there's a part of that. I also think it's just a lot of people's energy coming together to a single purpose can have the effect. And I also think, in a religious sense, that's kind of where, the higher being, God, whatever you want to call it, sort of sees the opportunity to do work. So I thank you for the compliment, but left to my own devices, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish it, and that's just being that's being real.
Yeah. I will now do the same thing that you just did, and say thank you
for the compliment.
Yeah, it does have something to do with the community, and clearly we do have an extraordinary community, and it came together in a really powerful way in that particular moment. But it's also the case that without your leadership, without your guidance, I don't think we would have been able to do what we did. So it was a project with many dimensions. One of which required effective legal counsel and strategy and wisdom. Another part of which required a supportive community. Another part of which I think does require this something other that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Whatever we might call it, the California woo-woo, the transcendent, or God, or whatever language folks are comfortable with, I'm okay with. But listen, let's dive in. Let's dive in to this time. I just want to hear from you. I want to know how your family's doing, and I want to know how you're doing in this time of COVID. This has affected us all in really crazy ways. But how are you guys getting along, and how has it affected your legal practice?
Well, just a little bit of a story about that. So when the world stopped in February, and I got sent home to sit in my bedroom and, literally sit on the side of my bed and contemplate all the things I've done wrong in my life. I was being punished by being sent to my room, because of the whole shutdown and the quarantine. I actually had been traveling like crazy. I was going to Boston for immigration cases. I was in New York. In fact, I was in New York on March 3rd in Lower Manhattan, staying overnight in hotels in Chinatown. And then shortly after that, I was in Boston, I think around the 12th or 13th, whatever it was, in March, for some detained hearings. And then the state, I think, closed on March 16th, and I couldn't even get into my office building. And because I had been in such high-risk areas, I really was sent to my room. My wife was putting the meals under the door, and
No kidding. Yeah. Huh.
I really was left, suddenly, from moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour and doing all the craziness, to suddenly, for 10 days being in quarantine. And I actually got sick. I had a wicked cough. I had the headache. I had the fever. I got tested much later, and it was negative. But my doctor told me that that didn't mean a lot. I could have had it. But fortunately, the rest of my family, they had colds, and we never knew what it was. It turned out safe, and I really had a moment of reflection on that, between moving very quickly and then suddenly being slammed to a dead stop.
Right.
Appreciating the fact that I had the privilege, and it really is all privilege, to just be able to be home in a nice place in Guilford, with the birds and the trees, and we're in a very secluded lot where we are. Something I never had time to appreciate or even acknowledge. I mean, it was just a bunch of weekend chores. I never really looked at my house as anything other than, I work at work, and then I go home, and it's just another place that I got to do my work. So
There are chores to do. Yes, I hear this.
Yeah, I mean, suddenly I was appreciative of, kind of basic stuff, um, like health and having a nice place to be. And then, while I was sitting in my room, trying to get my internet connection to work better, so I could stay up with work, I was checking in with clients, and as you know, a significant portion of my practice, it's not that they're below the poverty line. There is no line for them because they just don't show up. They're invisible, economically invisible. And there's reasons for that, that I could get into the legislation over the years. And so I was sitting there in my room, looking out my pretty window, talking with people who were really, really, really lost. And, not to be romantic about it or anything, but I had a sudden attack of anxiety about not being able to get out and work with my clients and get a hold of my clients. So, on the phone, I'm calling them.
Yeah.
And, so it was a mix. I mean, I was appreciative in the one sense, and then really, really worried and anxious in another sense about, my clients, because over 20 or more years of practice and working with them, they've sort of become part of my personality or my consciousness, or I mean, I don't want to say family because I don't think that's an appropriate term, but they're just part of my everyday. And then suddenly to find that they were in so much jeopardy. So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot that came out of it.
Yeah. How did you live with that moment? What did you do as a way of moving through that?
Well, I did a lot of useless projects once my wife let me out of quarantine around the house. But no, partly just as a lawyer, I do a lot of trial law, and you think in terms of metaphors, because it's how you explain things. And what I kind of realized at that moment was, I couldn't leave my house. I was afraid, at a certain level, I wasn't really, but at a certain level, I was afraid to leave my house because, remember, we didn't know much about this COVID thing, right? And
remember,
you'd go to at a minimum, I'd go to the grocery store, and I'll be all gloved up and masked up and afraid of everybody that was in there might have the COVID, right? I'm exaggerating a bit.
Well, not
much.
super much. I mean, a lot of us are feeling that.
Right. But I had a moment where I felt, I said, this has got to be at a certain level what it feels like to be here without documents, to belong to a community and yet be afraid of everything about the community, valuing and appreciating what you have, this house, this space, my family being healthy, and yet at the same time feeling very vulnerable that one of them could get sick from this mystery virus, or in the case of my clients, just suddenly be picked up by ICE, suddenly separated from their families, sort of a living death, if you would. And being afraid in my community and uncertain about where I could go and what I looked like. Did I stand up? Did I have my mask on? Did they have their mask on? And, there was a moment where I had a very strong sense of awareness as to what my clients have gone through. Now, did I need COVID to give me that? No. I mean, I kind of lived it vicariously through their stories. But to actually wear their clothes, in a sense, made me really understand what that was like. And then I thought about it from the community standpoint, from a larger standpoint. I thought, I wish somebody could explain, like, if you want to know what it's like to be an immigrant, imagine being financially insecure, afraid to leave your house, afraid that something mysterious or unknown is going to take your family, being afraid of your community, being afraid of your movements. And I thought, geez, this is what it feels like. This is what isolation, feels like. Community isolation must feel like. So yeah, I mean, I had a lot of metaphors that came to me, while I was going through, my little experience of COVID.
That's a really profound way to reflect on the experience of COVID, but to treat it metaphorically that way. I mean, I think it's a great explanatory tool for what many people deal with on a day-to-day basis.
And I also felt like in another from a different angle, that COVID was also sort of a test, right? Test of who you are as a human. And the people that sort of felt like, well, it doesn't affect me, the deniers. I'm not going to wear a mask. This is all a hoax. This isn't in my immediate orbit, so therefore it doesn't affect it, and I shouldn't be concerned about it, and I shouldn't be concerned about anybody else. That's sort of excessive narcissism. Yeah. that came in, and I really thought that COVID was separating us in a sense between people who do innately have compassion and people who do innately have a sense of understanding of other people, and people who do think beyond themselves, and those that don't. And not to say that in a judgmental way, because I think ultimately people who maybe don't think of other people, who don't have a sense of compassion or empathy, I just think they're maybe at a different place in their development. We're not all we're not all, toga or yogi wearing people who have elevated themselves, right? Such that we are, right? We're just at different places, and they're not behind us or in front of us. They're not below us or above us. They're just in a different place. And I thought maybe COVID for some people will be that experience that will move them towards more empathy, because at the end of the day, the one thing that I think is true of everybody, regardless of where they are, is that in isolation, you're pretty useless, right? I mean, if you take me out of the community, leave me alone in the woods, probably within a week, I'll be eating grubs, and living in a dirt hut. I'll have absolutely nothing. I will not be able to sustain myself.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the truth, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
If you start from the premise that without community and without other people, I'm living, at a very primitive, almost animalistic existence at that point.
Right.
So anyway, I think COVID's also becoming an opportunity for people to work on their empathy and work on their understanding, and hopefully, we'll have a lot of positive change by the time it lifts.
Yeah, well, clearly it's working for some. There are others that it seems as though it's not having that same effect. But who knows what's going on for folks? I don't know. Listen, let's delve into some of these issues around immigration this way. I first want to hear. So how much of your legal practice is devoted to immigration, and of that, how many pro bono cases do you have at any given time, where you're just working with folks like, because nobody else is going to work with them?
Yeah. So I think, using that 80-20 metaphor, immigration is about 80% of my work and about 20% of my net revenue. Fortunately, I have a general litigation practice, and with some luck, every few months, sometimes year, we'll have a big win in a personal injury case, or I have a couple of insurance companies that throw me hourly work. So I'm very fortunate. But that other part of the practice makes up about 20% of the work. So if you were to look at my immigration practice, I think it's probably pretty fair to say that it's all pro bono. I know on the last census that we did in the firm, which was at the end of last year, we had, I think it was just over 100 pro bono immigration removal cases. So people in court get the majority of my pro bono work, people who are facing removal or some sort of crisis. And then, everybody else is sliding scale. I mean, the non-critical cases is pay what you can when you have it. And, the nice thing about my immigration practice is that I have immigrants as clients. And they are, they don't leave you needing, they don't leave you for want. So I would say probably half would be truly pro bono. The costs, the ones that can't afford the costs, we have to pay for their costs, their FedEx and overnights and stuff.
I mean, 100 at any given time though it's
a rolling average, yeah.
Ginormous.
Until COVID hit the brakes, it was a lot. I was working with some community groups. We got special waivers from the clients for the ones that, were willing to work with a church to help support them, so that I could give certain information to a limited number of third parties.
Yeah.
That helped because a lot of what clients need, especially in removal, is they need basically social services. And I don't mean, food stamps. I'm talking about like just somebody to support them, to listen to them. And, I was fortunate. I had a lot of good paralegals, but they were getting overwhelmed, with the phone calls because people would just want to call and talk. And so the volunteers helped take some of that load off.
All right, so I'm gonna delve into so knowing a little bit about that background. 100 cases at any given time is a rolling average. Many of them pro bono. I want to delve into how you got to do what you're doing. How did you come to be doing this kind of work? I don't know. It strikes me as a fairly unusual life path. I mean, you could have chosen a career where you would have probably made quadruple the amount of money that you're making now, and obviously you're doing some really, really powerful community work. What's your background? What was your family like growing up? Where's this come from in you? Where's this come from?
I haven't, maybe before I finish in life, I'll understand that better. I grew up in rural New Hampshire, but
okay.
I grew up in rural New Hampshire, with plastic on the windows for a lot of the houses back in the 1970s and 80s, early 80s. And, I don't know where it came from. I went to law school down in DC. I went to Catholic University, and, there was a period in my late 20s and early 30s where I wanted to look like a model in an LL Bean catalog. I wanted a beautiful life kind of thing. Yeah. And, I didn't really understand what that meant. Back then when I was younger, I thought, a beautiful life was the end itself, a pretty house and a pretty wife and pretty kids. I have all those things. But what I didn't understand then that I understand now is that a pretty life is the byproduct of a meaningful life.
Yes.
And it's just a byproduct. It's not the end in itself. And when you pursue it, I think that's when people get in a lot of trouble. They get in a lot of financial trouble, and they get into personal trouble, and they're never satisfied. There's never a pretty enough life. So, what I have now is probably more the result of a meaningful life. And I didn't even know how to have a meaningful life. I mean, I was completely clueless when I got out of law school. And I worked for a firm in DC that did real estate and some real estate litigation. And then I came to Connecticut, and I worked in a firm in Cheshire. And then, just as things happen, and I remember too, it was in 1999, and I hadn't been at this law firm, and I had just moved from DC, And there's a legitimate way that this happened, and I'm going to tell you in a minute. Because I went to Catholic University, but out of nowhere, and I swear to God, I remember it was like 4:30, almost 5 o'clock, and I think it was on a Tuesday. I don't remember. I get a call from the reception. I'm at this firm in Cheshire, and I get a call from the reception saying that there's a monk in the lobby with a young Eritrean boy. And Cheshire, Connecticut's not the most diverse town. And the kid from Eritrea was probably one of a few people in that town at that time with a passport. Just leave it at that. That wasn't from the West. And so I come out into the lobby, and there is this monk in a full frock, a Franciscan monk, and this skinny kid, 15-year-old kid from Eritrea. And they said, well, we're here to talk to you about an immigration case. I had zero experience, zero. I mean, my wife's from Australia, so I guess maybe I had 0.01%, but we paid a lawyer in DC that took care of her paperwork. So I really didn't have any experience. And he couldn't go back because Ethiopia at the time had just overrun Eritrea. And I later found that it was Friar John from the Bronx had sent them to Cheshire, Connecticut from the Bronx. And a long story short, I was able to resolve that kid's case. It was a pro bono case. And then after that, I started getting people from the Congo that would find me in Cheshire. And at a certain point, working for other people and taking pro bono asylum cases sort of runs into an inherent conflict because they want to pay your salary and they want you to pay for your salary through legal work, and pro bono doesn't pay for it. So I ended up starting my own practice when my wife was about 9. She was late, so she was like 9.5 months pregnant with our first child. And I started the practice with a handful of, like real estate, miscellaneous cases, and about 30 pro bono asylum cases. And then I just learned over the years, and the practice grew. I mean, immigrants, I shouldn't sound like some great philanthropist, because I'm not, because even though I may be representing an individual pro bono, that client brings the community in, and there's other ways that they contribute, to my practice, so if I get them, maybe they start a business and they come back, they're getting sued on a contract, they come back. So there's other work that often springs out of it.
Yeah. No, I get that.
And then I never looked back. I mean, I've been 20 something years in my own practice, kind of running it the same way.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna ask you can answer this however you want to answer, but I know you go to church. I know you.
I go to a lot of churches. I don't go to one. Sometimes I stay in the church basement.
But I also know that you have, you regularly make reference to particular stories from the Bible or particular practices that emerge from Christian faith. So tell me about that for you. Like, what is your relationship to a life of faith? I mean, and it seems to inform a lot of what you do, and it seems to inform a lot of how you engage many of the situations that your clients face. I've always been curious to know more about what is that for Glenn?
Yeah. So, well, in terms of faith, I think I've frustrated a lot of clergy over the years. When I was at Catholic, I'm an Episcopalian by baptism, and when I was at Catholic University, they were trying to convert me. Father O'Brien was my academic advisor, and he really wanted me to convert. But I was going to the National Cathedral every afternoon to read, because they have this beautiful garden there, which I just found a very holy place. The cathedral itself, of course, has a special energy to it. But there's this one garden, and Father O'Brien was pulling me into his office once a week to talk about my conversion, like when I was going to convert before I graduated. And I kept frustrating him. And at one point, I'll never forget, he got mad at me and he said, Glenn, he said, you're in some ways, he says, you're absolutely pathetic. He says, you're just one of these people who's like a sponge. You always go towards where there's this energy for, sadness or whatever. And I said, what are you talking about? I go to this garden, that's where I read. Well, what he told me, which I didn't know, was that there's this rose garden in the Bishop's Garden, which has grass. It's like a big rectangle of grass. And then there's roses surrounding it. And then there's a statue of the Prodigal Son. It's like sort of a modern art representation of a prodigal son. And he told me that that's where there were something like the ashes of some 500 AIDS patients. And he was railing against me saying, your Episcopal bishop wouldn't put him in the cathedral, he puts him out in his garden. So we had this whole back and forth theological argument. And I ended up, of course, I didn't become Catholic. So I went on from there to explore a little further with the Episcopal faith. And when we moved to Connecticut, particularly, we belonged to a couple of different local parishes. But I always struggled with being a good church, like going and sitting in church and listening on. It just didn't, it wasn't enough of a workout, so to speak. It was just too easy. It was too comfortable and a little bit boring at times.
No,
and,
come on, man. Oh, no.
Nothing against church going. I need to go more. But that was right.
That wouldn't have happened at our church.
I know. And actually, that's why I have such a strong affiliation with the Congos as well. So two things sort of happened at that point. I was actually on the vestry of one of the churches. They invited me on the vestry, and which was a really eye-opening experience. But two things happened. One is my immigration practice started to develop. I had those 30 Congolese asylum cases. And the second thing that happened was I discovered this Episcopal monastery up in Boston called the Society of St. John the Evangelist. And it's these sort of progressive, hip Episcopal monks who live in communion in Cambridge, and then they have a retreat house in West Newbury. It's beautiful. Very, quiet sort of theology, if you know what I mean. They don't proselytize or anything like that. And it's very much about self-exploration. So I would go up there for retreats, silent retreats. And at the same time, I'm experiencing this eye-opening, life-changing experience of working with immigrants and asylees. And one of the primary metaphors that struck me was the theology of the crucifixion, right? And what I would see in working with my clients, and I'm not trying to say my clients are all Christ-like or anything like that, but what they were experiencing, the isolation, the Good Fridays, where, you could really go too far with this metaphor, so I just want to be careful.
I got you, but I'm with it. Yeah.
The thing was that they would have this moment of crucifixion, where they would really have to confront all of their fears, and sort of everything would come back. And there would be family members that would stand at the foot of their cross and witness them going through this great trial. And they were always alone in it. Even if I was there, even if their family was there, they were always alone on the cross, so to speak. And, in one way or the other, whether it was through some magical relief that would happen through the immigration process, which used to be more possible than it is today, they would have their Easter morning, and I would see them sort of come out of that, transition from that. And then sometimes they didn't have their Easter morning. And I also, so working with that metaphor, I also have felt for years that the difference between the American Empire and the Roman Empire is that the Roman Empire was a little more honest about their crucifixions. They lined them up on the road, crucified them. And here we do it in the quiet corridors of the immigration system, or our our criminal justice system. We sort of crucify people in different ways, and much more covert about it than the Romans were. But I really started to see that and start to understand that, and that for me translated into a personal theology where I stopped seeing challenges and problems and disappointments in life for just for what they were, and I started to see them in a larger process. So if I were going through, without opening up too much, a particularly difficult episode or something, not the same way, but I would start to recognize the pattern. This is I'm about to begin another crucifixion. I know that I'm going to have, sometimes that metaphor started to be so clear to me that I would know. I said, oh my gosh, I'm getting near my Good Friday moment. And once you sort of embrace that metaphor, and it's not just a metaphor, I don't want to take anything away from the New Testament and faith. I mean, that's true. I'm just talking about it from the perspective of a metaphor, a personal metaphor, to understand experience. Once I started to really understand that, I stopped getting crucified, and I started to see things. And if you look at Christianity, in a sense, it's about failure, right? I mean, the crucifixion is, in a sense, the ultimate failure. It's also the ultimate success. And it really makes you start to look at things differently from that perspective. And in immigration, and you know this just with the experience you've had, all I do with immigration is lose. Like any other lawyer would look at my win record and think, my God, why do you even bother anymore? Because you always lose. I mean, immigration is about losing until suddenly you win. You just keep appealing. You try a different application. You try a lawsuit. You try this. You try that. You go in church basements. You come out of church basements. You go back to the court. You come from the court. But ultimately, it's a lot of failure. And you have to, just to work in that for 20 years of failure, you have to understand it as something more than failure. And ultimately, and ultimately, when I look back on the cases, even though I've lost a lot of cases, I've actually lost very few clients. In other words, many of my clients are still here through one grace or another. A disproportionate number of clients are still here. I don't know how. I mean, they are. Like, I never close their files. We always have they always have their file. Even after they've finished all the proceedings, we got to stay with ICE. So we figure it out. But that to me is a very Christian, or is a very spiritual, I shouldn't even call it Christian, it's a very spiritual experience, and it's a very spiritual perspective.
I mean, that answer is so rich, and it was so much deeper than I had anticipated. I expected you to say, like, I read the Bible, I don't know, I go to church sometimes, like, but I mean, to actually have this sort of grounding experience of being able to understand what your clients are going through and what you're going through, as well as being this kind of crucifixion moment, a Holy Saturday moment, with maybe an Easter Sunday on the other side. Holy smokes. One of the things that I was really drawn to in your description of yourself is this notion that when you were going to the cathedral, this priest said that you were a sponge for sorrow. Is that?
Yeah,
or sorrow stories?
Something like that. I wish I wish I could remember whatever it was, which I can't remember exactly what he said, but I remember exactly what I felt about what he said, because it was very revelatory for me. But it was something like being a sorrow sponge or something, like you just always gravitate to where there's sorrow. And he wasn't saying it in a good way. I mean, he was ripping me one for it. But yeah, no, and how true it was. I mean, if you want to experience sorrow, hang out with immigrants.
Yes, yes, yes.
And at the
Um,
same time, I will tell you, even though they're full of sorrow and there's a strength there and an understanding about life that I still haven't gotten my head around. I'm trying,
yeah,
I just haven't figured it out yet.
yeah. Well, what this does for me is to help name, I guess, why I experience you, in addition to being a very skilled lawyer, as being a somebody incredibly skilled at pastoral care. Um, you seem to know how to enter these very sorrowful stories, um, and sit there, if not comfortably, at least not to run from them. And I don't know. I watched you with Malik and Zaida and with a number of other folks as well, and it was clear to me that you've got a deep pastoral vocation in addition to a legal one.
Yeah, I mean,
And I don't mean that in a churchy sense. I don't mean that in a dogmatic confessional sense. I just mean it in an ability to dwell with the sorrow and not run and hide from it.
yeah, I mean, I think I don't know about I think I'd be a failed pastor. I couldn't do what you do, Steve, on a day in, day out basis. But it's a different skill set as a lawyer, and honestly, I would tell you, in some ways, it's an easier skill set, right? I mean, I think the pastoral part is a lot of patience. It's a lot of sitting, and listening and waiting. Because most sorrow is a waiting anyways. You're just waiting. It's that, 4 a.m. and you're laying there and you don't think the sun's going to come up, and every bit of science and every expert would tell you the sun's going to come up in about an hour, whatever. Look at the Farmer's Almanac, but you're laying there and you don't know if it's going to come up.
That's right.
You're not sure that this day it's going to come up. That's just a matter of waiting, right? That's the ultimate patience, is to wait, even though you don't believe this is going to work out or the sun's going to come up. Just the patience to wait and see if it does. That's the hardest part, and I couldn't do that. And that to me is what a working pastor does, is wait with people, sits with them.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. I also, it seems to me you do that. Anyway, but
sometimes that's all we've got. That's what we're working with.
That's right.
I mean, that's the ultimate futility about immigration law. I mean, not to pivot, but off that subject, but related to immigration. The other thing that immigration teaches you is how we perceive each other. Especially in the past 4 years, and I won't talk politics, but my clients have really been attacked and demonized and dehumanized. It's not just demonization, it's the dehumanization. And you just listen to the rhetoric and trying to understand, people, and even in my somewhat open-minded community of Guilford, whether I'm standing on the side of a playing field, watching my kids' game, people make comments to me about, my work. And they're not trying to be rude to my face. It's just, the way they talk about it. And what I've really come to understand about my clients and about the way we perceive each other is that our society has gone to a point where we don't see humans anymore, right? And I don't know if it's, internet porn, where, people, sort of satisfy themselves by looking at other people, oftentimes suffering, especially when you're talking about some of the grotesqueness of internet porn. So we've dehumanized people, through that, whether it's the internet games, which gives us points for dehumanizing and killing people, whether it's political rhetoric, where, it doesn't matter what the other person's saying, you just have to listen to what I'm telling you right now.
Yes.
We so separated ourselves from each other and dehumanized, and certainly the internet, social media, where we don't even have attribution as a requirement. Like, you don't even have to put your name to what you're saying, right? So talk about removing. And then I start to understand how people can be so cruel and so disconnected from suffering of immigrants, whether they're locked up in cages or being forced to get hysterectomies or being marched out of the country, or being given sham hearings and then sent back to their death. Then you start to really understand it, and all of this, just because this is my work. If I was a stonemason, I imagine stones would tell me, but those are the metaphors and the understandings that immigration has started to give me over the years.
Yeah. All right. So look, I want to be mindful of time and mindful of your time in particular. But I have a couple of more questions, and here's where I'd like to take us as we bring this to a close. So I don't know, there may be people out there who are watching who think of immigration as a fairly cut and dry thing, i.e., we have laws, and those laws have to do with who can be here, and if you break those laws, there are consequences. I'm wondering for those who have such a view, how you would explain or open up some of the complexities and nuances, and I don't know, openings within those questions. How would you open up kind of let's say a very kind of cut and dry notion of what immigration is, or what our legal responsibilities are?
So, just so you know, as much as, I work with immigrants, I'm not someone who right now, and I mean right now, believes in open borders. And the reason I don't believe in open borders, just so you know, is because I don't think as a society we're anything remotely close to being ready for open borders. We would destroy ourselves. Not the people coming across the borders, it's the people here we just couldn't manage ourselves. All you have to do is look at where we are in 2020. But no, I mean, I think people, before you start talking about laws that people are allegedly breaking, I think you have to understand how our immigration system has been set up and how it actually works. I mean, we have a foreign policy. I mean, you have to start with our foreign policy and our trade policy, right? That exploits the natural resources of just about every other place on the planet, right? We've exploited them in our own country, but we certainly, there's something different when you do it in another country. We've manipulated their governments over the years, whether it's through fighting communism or, the drug trade, that we've all participated in, or even just the desire to have, a $5 t-shirt, right? We want everything cheap and we want it now, right? We don't want to spend a lot of money. In fact, you go to the store, you're not looking to spend the most expensive thing. We're trained to find the most cheapest thing. Well, that comes at a real cost, right? So whether you're buying a t-shirt or an avocado, I mean, avocados right now are subject to the same drug lords, apparently, are trafficking in avocados, believe it or not. But that's all driven by us. We are the ones creating that hardship and that disruption in these other communities. And we're doing it in a lot of different ways. So we're creating the demand for migration. That's one thing. And then there's another side of it too. The United States gets a lot of economic benefit from cheap farm labor. And someone picking a head of lettuce isn't just picking a head of lettuce. There's a lot more that goes into agricultural work than just sort of being a machine. You have to know when to pick the lettuce. You have to know how to pick the lettuce. You need to know which lettuce to pick. I mean, there's just a lot more that goes into it. And there's an intelligence. But regardless, we don't want to pay fair value for it because we don't want to pay a lot for our salads, right? So we benefit from illegal migration. We don't want to pay a lot for our roofs to get fixed. We don't want to pay a lot for our hotel rooms to get cleaned. So we benefit from this, quote, illegal migration that everybody talks about. So it's incredibly hypocritical to say we shouldn't give people a fair chance from other countries, that we shouldn't have an opportunity for people to stay here once we've invited them in or we've pushed them in. Because immigration is either we've pushed them into the country or we've invited them into the country. It's not like anybody's breaking into the country. It just isn't. I mean, you can say that because it's convenient, but it's just not the way it works. And likewise, we want to take, all of the top talent from around the world to come into the United States and give us US patents. And we want those US patents because they, help US companies, and those US companies help US 401ks. And so we benefit, from this foreign migrant labor that comes in at the upper levels as well as the quote lower levels, although I don't really like to distinguish in that way. But, from the more manual, from the intellectual to the manual, we benefit from this migration. We also benefit by having a system set up that criminalizes, it makes it very difficult and expensive. Expensive meaning you got to pay a lot for a US education if you're coming in overseas, which offsets the cost of US education for US citizens. We want to criminalize manual labor because it drives down the cost of manual labor. Manual labor won't organize, they won't get workers' comp, they won't call in sick, or if they, they're not going to engage in the society. So it's the perfect manual labor, right? Non-engaged manual labor. So when people start talking to me about illegal immigration, I think we need to be talking about illegal foreign policy or illegal trade policy, or illegal social policy, because the same construct that you're using to criminalize and declare illegal, certain paths of immigration, you're doing the same thing on the other end of it as you benefit from that illegal construct. So, that's a mouthful and a headful, but I just can't listen anymore to people that try to tell me about, well, we have laws and they should come in legally. We have laws so that they're pushed in or they're held here, but those laws are benefiting us. They're not benefiting the immigrant. So.
That's beautifully put. All right, semi-last question, but this is maybe big, maybe too big to answer, but how would you reform our immigration system if you could paint with broad brushstrokes? Like, what would you recommend for an incoming administration potentially? What needs to happen?
I think just broad brush. I think they do three things. One is they should just start over with the Immigration and Nationality Act, literally just rewrite it. But so I don't really believe in reform as much as rewriting the immigration law.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I think the new construct would be, you have to end this suffering. So you have to allow families that are here to stay here. Just end of story. You're not talking about, given our population growth, you're not going to be doing anything to the population. If anything, you're going to be putting more people into the system so that they can pay Social Security and Medicare. So the people who are here would have to stay here. The second thing is I would set up a temporary worker program for people from designated countries. So instead of penalizing countries that are in economic and political strife, you would use the immigration system to help them. And the way you would do that, presumably, is allow 6-month visas where they could come and work for 6 months. Ideally with very minimal tax. Maybe they just pay a Social Security that they can't collect, but they wouldn't be paying taxes. And all of that money would be going back to their communities to fund businesses and, sort of direct financial aid to specific communities within Guatemala and El Salvador, which over time, I believe, would have the effect of taking away some of the gang pressures and some of the other corruptions. I mean, it would have to be tied with a larger foreign policy initiative in those areas. But by doing that, what you're really doing is you're saying, come in for 6 months, leave, come back for 6 months. And the separation of 6 months is important. And it's not so much about kicking them out, right? It's really about making sure that they are keeping their roots and their connections in their communities back home, so that we're not bankrupting those communities. So, and that they stay connected with those communities and their family. Many of my clients, I believe, would, if given the option, want to go back. One of the problems we have is that it's so difficult to come back in, that they're separated from their children sometimes for decades. There's mothers that never see their children because they're here working to fund those children, right? So that would be a very important part. And then certainly there would be a path to legitimizing their status with no immigration violations, not legitimizing, but making their status permanent if they want it to be.
Yeah.
Over time. And then the third category would be intellectual migration, is that we would open up opportunities for people who want to come here and give us their intellectual work product, basically, with the exception that we would have to work out a way that, and this is a much more complicated issue, that there was, the country from which they came isn't being drained of all of their intellectual capital, and that's, I could get into that, but it's going to take a lot longer than a few minutes as to how you do that. It's working with a lot of temporary work authorization visas and even a permanent resident system that requires a certain amount of time in their home country, so that we're not taking all the good doctors out of India or wherever.
Right. All right, I want to wrap this up, but this is the last thing.
Thank you for asking that, because I got to tell you, I'm just waiting for somebody to ask me how to reform the immigration system. So thank you.
No, I mean, I hope that if there is a new administration, I hope that there are people waiting in the wings, perhaps people waiting to call on qualified immigration attorneys like Glenn Formica to say, what do we do? And let's
go be listening. Waiting for the call.
Yeah. No, but I think that's an extraordinarily helpful series of prescriptions, and I do hope that somebody out there is listening, and I hope that these conversations are happening actually right now, in whatever corridors of power need to have those conversations. All right, last thing, and then I'll let you go. What's giving you hope these days? Or conversely, if you're not hopeful, tell me why.
I will tell you that I think and I'm not talking politics, even though it's about politics, I think if this administration departs or ends in a couple of weeks, because we're in October of 2020, I think that this administration will have been the most important presidential administration probably in the last 100 years, maybe in the history of the country. Because even though he's done it through all of the wrong ways, our current president has held a mirror. And I sometimes feel like as a country, we are an alcoholic who is looking into the mirror the morning after and saying, I'm never going to drink again. It means it this time. Because he's finally been able to see himself for what he's become from all the binge drinking and all the lying and all of the self-delusion. That gives me a lot of hope. I think
beautiful, man.
I think that we're about to go into a really good period in this country. It's not going to be easy, and I don't think it's over yet. But I think within a year or two, we're going to start to see a sunrise instead of a sunset.
Yep. That is a fabulous metaphor to use, and I so hope that you're right about that. I think there's something to it, actually. I really do think you're onto something there. But it's a great way to end this. I want to thank you for the conversation. Thank you for
listening.
Well, yeah, of course. But thank you for all the work that you do. But I know that I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, and just hearing you talk theologically about your work and what it means to you is something I haven't had the chance to do with you. So I really value that. And I've loved it. And I know that there will be many people in our community and elsewhere who access it who will also really relate to it. So listen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll close it off and wish you well in all that you're doing and all the many cases that you have. I know we'll be intersecting before too long to speak about some of those, but yeah, just know that for now I'm really, really grateful for our friendship, but for your work as well.
Yeah, same here, Steve. Same here.
All right.
Stay well.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Talk to you soon.
Bye, guys.
To all of you out there, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know I benefited immensely from talking to Glenn. And he's got a way of thinking in metaphors and thinking theologically that I think is profoundly instructive, at least for one such as me, but I hope it was for you as well. Love to all of you out there. We're still in this time of Corona. And we're still in this time of love, in the time of Corona. Be well, and I will see you soon. Love you all. Bye.